and welcome to PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, Ian Hartitz. Happy championship week. Got AFC, NFC championships coming up here on Sunday. Going to be a great day to be great as always. But as has been our theme here over the last few episodes on the podcast, still very much in review of 2022 mode. So, go get your bets down for Sunday and, go freak out about every single head coach and offensive coordinator hiring. If you're a national reporter, you can ignore all the bad things these coaches have done that got them fired in the first place and just bring up, some good event that they participated in 10, 15 years ago and say it's a good hire so you don't ruin your sources. So whatever you want to do and deal with this time is fine by me. But again, still very much on the PFF Fantasy Football Podcast, trying to make sure we don't miss any big takeaways from what happened in 2022 so that we can safely and hopefully profitably, if that's the right word, sounds kind of right, move on to 2023 and beyond with, clear eyes, a full heart. And then hopefully we can't lose per Coach Taylor. So with that in mind, guys, finally, much anticipated, at least I've been, anticipated about doing this, is my quarterback takeaways column and thus podcast here ahead of 2023. So looking at what happened last season, 5 big questions struck me because this was a historic season in terms of the overall dominance at the quarterback position. We had Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, and Patrick Mahomes all post top 12 seasons ever in terms of fantasy points per game. I mean, for a while, I think we've all wrapped our minds around, the Konami code quarterback, shout out Rich Rebar, JJ Zachariason. It's not brain science to figure out that we've had quarterbacks that run the ball a lot. And because of that, don't even need to be great passers in order to be great fantasy quarterbacks. That's been, one of the molds and what we've looked for in late round quarterbacks in the past, and we will continue to do so for years to come. But only recently have we started to get these true aliens emerging at the position where they're complementing high upside rushing ability with passing production that isn't even dissimilar to what we're seeing pocket quarterbacks have who can't run at all. So again, this dominance got me thinking about 5 key questions that I wanted to answer and hopefully wrap our minds around. Was 2022's, again, high-end dominance at the position just a historical outlier and a really great season for those guys, or was it more so a sign of things to come and perhaps reason for us to start spending up more on quarterbacks in fantasy drafts? So those 5 questions that we're going to answer today. Is fantasy scoring going up in general at quarterback? Question number 2, is the discrepancy between fantasy's top tier QB1s growing versus the lower end QB1s? So what I mean with that is QB 1 through 6 overall, are they getting a lot better just compared to QB 7 through 12? Because as we know, we have the RB1s, the wide receiver 1 discussion where it's top 12 versus, the guys that are finishing RB 13 through RB 24. But with quarterback, majority of our redraft leagues only having one of them, quarterback and tight end might honestly be better off referring to, QB 1 through 6 as QB1s, QB 7 through 12 as QB2s. Also, question number 3, have the top tier fantasy quarterbacks gotten more expensive in terms of ADP? So if we have determined that, yes, those top 6 quarterbacks are performing worlds better than the next 6 quarterbacks, has that been priced in appropriately to the preseason ADP? Question number 4 obviously needs to be then, how is the fantasy industry done at identifying the season's top quarterbacks in terms of the preseason ADP? Because guess what? If we can't figure out who these guys are before the season, then what's the point of trying to exploit that? And finally, question number 5, is there still hope for finding an upside fantasy quarterback in the later rounds? So again, gonna answer all these questions here on the PFF Fantasy Football Podcast, and all the charts and stuff I'm referencing you can find on pff.com in my column that will be up there on January 27th, lovely Friday. So first question we're going to answer, guys, is fantasy scoring going up in general at quarterback? And the answer is a resounding yes, and it's not even really all that close. If you look at it in terms of both the top 6 scoring and the top 12 scoring, it's been reaching really, I only went back 10 years because I don't know what, fantasy points per game from quarterbacks tell us from 1992 versus nowadays, but 10 years, pretty solid sample size here. And you look at that, each of the past 5 seasons, so 2018, 19, 20, 21, 22, that average of the top 6 fantasy quarterbacks has been greater than any season from 2013 to 2017. So we really have seen the top tier of quarterbacks over the past 5 years begin to score fantasy points at a much higher rate than we were seeing before that. So same trend is holding true when looking at the top 12 versus top 6. Unsurprisingly, in the year 2022, 2023 now of our Lord, we have quarterbacks with these dual threat talents really rising to the occasion, becoming more and more fantasy friendly. As we talked about a couple of episodes ago, looking at, our kind of big time overachievers and underachievers in terms of ADP, we were looking at some of these numbers for the rushing, Konami Code quarterbacks. And guys, it truly is wild and it's a big if, because we saw guys like Malik Willis, Sam Ehlinger, who theoretically, and yes, Sam Ehlinger, if you look at his Texas rushing stats, freaking ridiculous. I know he's not Malik Willis in terms of just the talent and stuff, but just we had two quarterbacks that if they could have started, 8-10 games, like they would have fit this criteria, but they couldn't. They weren't good enough passers. So it's not 100% success rate. But guys, looking at over these past 10 years, if a quarterback has averaged more than 6 rush attempts per game, between 6 and 9 specifically was the group I looked at, 42% chance they finish in the top 6, 9 or more carries, 62.5%. Meanwhile, we look at the pocket passers, between 0 and 5.99 carries per game, we're not even reaching a 20% hit rate in terms of the top 6 quarterbacks. So really, quarterbacks that run a lot just have so much extra room to boom rather than bust. And again, that's helped contribute to more and more fantasy football scoring at the quarterback position than we have seen over the past 10 years. Next question. Is the discrepancy between fantasy's top tier QB1s growing versus the lower end QB1s? So basically, again, this last year, if you had your Jalen Hurts, your Josh Allen, your Patrick Mahomes, you know how big of an advantage that was on a week-to-week basis compared to the guys that were forced to get by with your Kirk Cousins, your Derek Carrs, and all that. And guys, like, that really wasn't just you should have been feeling like that, because it came out of nowhere, more or less, is what I'm trying to say. I took the difference between that average scoring between every year's QB 1 through 6 bucket and the QB 7 through 12 bucket to see if that disparity in 2022 was larger than it's ever been. And the answer is a resounding yes. In 2022, the QB 1 through QB 6 averaged 22.6 fantasy points per game, QB 7 through QB 12 all the way down to 17.7. That difference of 4.9 fantasy points, easily the highest of the past 10 years. The average from 2013 to 2021 was only an advantage of 2.8 points. The highest single season mark was 3.4. So literally 1.5 higher discrepancy between these groups. Does this mean that, the top end, the top tier, the elite quarterbacks in fantasy all of a sudden need to be prioritized way ahead of what we're seeing from the QB 7 through 12 group? Not necessarily, because if you do go back literally just 1 year, all of a sudden we find the closest discrepancy between that group. So in 2021, we actually had the low-end QB1s holding their own against the top-tier QB1s more than we had seen over the past decade, before this last year when it all came crashing down, where they couldn't hold up their end of the bargain while the top-tier QB1s kept on keeping on. And that really is a key takeaway in this part. Again, quarterback scoring, QBs 1 through 6, QBs 1 through 12, it's all reaching really, really high levels, but it's been more consistent in terms of the top 6 quarterbacks every year, which again, I think makes sense. We haven't seen that many aliens in the league. We can count them on one hand, maybe need an extra finger or two, sorry, Jason Pierre-Paul, but looking at, again, the QB 7 through 12 range, that's when I think we're starting to get into a lot of the guys that honestly were busting this last year, the quarterbacks that don't have that rushing floor and accordingly can't give us the same crazy fantasy football ceiling and floor to the equation. So I do think this is even better represented when we look at the QB 1 through 6 bucket versus now our high-end QB 2. So looking at the quarterbacks that were ranked QB 13 to QB 18, and probably should have stayed at the beginning, but when I'm doing these quarterback rankings, guys, I did go per game. I'm not trying to completely just reward availability here, although I do, acknowledge that it is probably the most important ability in real life. That said, though, per game, and you need a minimum of 8 starts. So just keep that in mind when I'm referring to all these ranks. But again, we do see a more clear trend of quarterback 1 through 6 really separating themselves between quarterbacks 13 through 18 over these past 4 years. And specifically, we've seen 4 consecutive top 10 year jumps basically between these two buckets. So overall, QBs 1 through 6 really reaching higher levels than ever. Again, each of these past 5 years were higher than anything we saw in the trailing 5 years before that. A little bit more inconsistent in terms of the low-end QB1 group, and we haven't seen any sort of consistency in terms of the QB2s and beyonds. Again, you look at this QB 13 through 18 bucket, and over these past 2 seasons, they've been scoring the same amount of fantasy points as they were in 2013 and 2014, which is not even close to true for our QB1 group. So again, huge advantage. Because think about it too, this QB 13 through 18 bucket, like that's who you're having to go to on the waiver wire, or when someone gets injured, or when someone gets bust. So that really just goes to show you, again, having those top tier guys, such an advantage if you can get them at the right price. So that takes us into our next question. Have the top tier fantasy quarterbacks gotten more expensive in terms of ADP? Because if everything I said, and again, and it is true, I've looked up the data and that's what I'm presenting to you guys right now. It doesn't matter if the pricing of the players is all just correlated perfectly. However, that's not what we're seeing, guys. Shout out to Fantasy Pros for providing me with all this ADP data. You can go get it yourself over on their website. I believe you just have to make a free account. But both high-end and low-end QBs are a bit more expensive than they were in 2018 and 2019, but we're still not looking at anything close to what happened in 2013 through 2015. I mean, in those years, guys, really was still the tail end of an era where quarterbacks were getting drafted a lot higher in fantasy drafts. Nowadays, you maybe have one Joe Schmo or two, taking the guy in round one or round two. But I think more and more the industry, there's so many smart people just providing content for free and podcasts like this one you can listen to. And just general ADP has gotten sharper, especially by the time people draft closer to September, more often than not for the more casual observers of the group. But yeah, have not seen the quarterbacks quite get all the way down to what they were then, because the average draft, average ADP, I should say, the overall pick number I'm talking about. So not just, the QB1, I'm talking about pick number 25 or whatever in the draft. So from 2013 to 2015 for QBs 1 through 6, they were all going inside of the first 3 rounds of the draft. Specifically, it was an average ADP of 25, 26, and 27. Over these past 3 years, it's been at 40, 35, and 39. So we're still seeing these quarterbacks, going a full round and a half later over these past 3 years compared to where they were going about a decade ago. Now, they are not quite as cheap as they were in 2018 and 2019. 2017 was a brutal year in terms of scoring. When I was talking earlier about the fantasy points per game by the year, 2017 was actually the lowest single year among the whole crop before things started to stabilize immediately after that. So again, we saw things really drop off in 2018, 2019. Those were the 2 years where you could really get these quarterbacks at an affordable price. But also look at that timeline. That's when these aliens started to come into the league in the first place and started to change the nature of the game. Patrick Mahomes, 2018 first year. Lamar Jackson, 2019 first year. Josh Allen came in 2018. Jalen Hurts came in 2020. Kyler Murray came in 2019. He had obviously some bonkers years in terms of points per game, at least production putting up there. So really over these past 5 years, we've seen these guys come in and accordingly just, I think, start to break the game a little bit, guys. Rushing quarterbacks that have that high-end passing ability, it's what we're seeing from the Christian McCaffreys and the Austin Ecklers of the world, where they just have such high-performing numbers in 2 facets of the game. Players with only one means of production can't even compete with them. So again, need to make sure that we're checking all of our boxes here. But so far, we've been able to establish that not only is the scoring of the top tier quarterback ones in fantasy land higher than ever, but it's also been at an affordable price relative to what we were seeing 10 years ago. So that's great, Ian. Quarterbacks are scoring a lot. They're doing it relatively cheap. Well, can we actually identify them in a reasonable manner? And luckily, guys, the answer is yes. So answering question number 4 here. How has the fantasy industry done at identifying the season's top quarterbacks in terms of preseason ADP, and particularly the top tier, that QB 1 through 6 bucket? They've been pretty great. Looking at this again, the average positional ADP for the first 6 quarterbacks drafted over the past 3 years, it's been QB6, QB5, and QB6. So we've really been nailing it. And I've seen JJ Zacharyson, the late round QB, publish some similar work over the last year where basically we've just gotten better in terms of our preseason ADP, specifically at quarterback, at predicting who are going to be those leaders by the time the season is done. So that's fantastic. The guys, top 6 quarterbacks. And you look at what happened this past year as I pull up my handy dandy Excel year. No one really came out of absolutely nowhere. Maybe we were seeing 10 years ago when we had less fantasy friendly quarterbacks that were giving us this, again, stupid volume discrepancy between what, again, the best quarterbacks were doing and what some of the worst were doing. So looking at just last year in the top quarterbacks, Jalen Hurts finished as the QB1 in fantasy points per game. He was the ADP QB6 by the time September came around. Josh Allen QB2, drafted as the QB1. Patrick Mahomes QB3, drafted as the QB2. Joe Burrow QB4, drafted as the QB7. Justin Fields QB5, drafted as the QB17. Lamar Jackson QB6, again, fantasy points per game with a minimum 8 starts. Lamar was balling as much as people want to try to deny it when he was out there. I know he slowed down after the hot start, but you know what? He had to have the hot start in the first place. Anyway, finished as the QB6 fantasy points per game, drafted as the QB4. So really have been effective at finding those top 6 guys. And again, that's been a 3-year trend now. And even before that, we're not seeing brutal positional ADPs getting blown out of the water. The big difference here, and this is a big takeaway, we have not been nearly as accurate at identifying who the QB 7 through 12, the low-end QB1s, if you will, in terms of the preseason ADP. I mean, you look at what happened last season, QB 7 through 12, that group, guys, their average positional ADP in the preseason was the QB 20, pick 148, and this is for the low-end quarterbacks, and it's not just a one-year wonder. I mean, 20 and 148, those numbers, those are 10-year highs, but we've also seen 2 of the other, so basically 3 of the total worst, the 3 worst seasons in terms of quarterbacks, us just really misidentifying who the low-end QB1s were in the preseason relative to who they wound up being. The 3 worst seasons have all come in the last 4 years, so not just a 1-year blip on the radar with this. 2019, 2020, and 2022 alike, we really saw those low-end QB1s come much deeper in the draft than where they were necessarily thought to be in the preseason, and never did we see that stronger than this last year. And we can't exactly blame every single person with it. Trey Lance, who knew he was going to, snap his freaking leg in week 2. We also had Kirk Cousins, where didn't start off strong, but finished strong. Then again, guys, Derek Carr, Russell Wilson, Aaron Rodgers. I mean, that truly was a dead zone after we got through the first 6 quarterbacks this year. And ultimately, you've been better off fading that second tier of quarterbacks in favor of guys like Justin Fields, Trevor Lawrence, and Daniel Jones, among other ones. So again, getting back to our kind of who are the biggest over and under achievers of the positions, conversation we had a week or 2 ago. Don't hate the player, hate the ADP. This is a 1-year thing. And some of those guys I just named, Derek Carr, Russell Wilson, Aaron Rodgers, they were all studs in 2021. So I'm not saying, the process was egregiously wrong with that. But I do think that because of how great the quarterbacks 1 through 6s are, I don't think we've done a good enough job separating the Jalen Hurts, the Josh Allens, the Patrick Mahomeses of the world from that next group of quarterbacks. Because when you look at it, there's no reason that Jalen Hurts and Derek Carr should have had, a wider gap between them. I'm sorry, it was a lesser gap. The gap between Jalen Hurts and Derek Carr in terms of their ADP was less than that of Derek Carr and Jared Goff. So who would you feel better about going in the season? Jalen Hurts or a Kyler Murray and Derek Carr? Of course you're going to take the alien, but we still felt better about Derek Carr and Jared Goff, and that's fine. I mean, again, I don't think that's an egregious thing. They were adding Adams, plenty of weapons there. Josh McDaniels, you could talk yourself into that being an upgrade, but the disparity in which we were showing that confidence between guys like Carr, Jared Goff, Daniel Jones, and those guys, that was the problem. So again, our ability has been proven not to be nearly as strong picking those low-end QB1s as it has been the high-end QB1s. So, hey, that's all pretty damn good for the top-tier QBs, guys. What this has taught me is that when we see years like last year where we had Jalen Hurts and Kyler Murray leaking in the round 6 or being late 5-round guys, Patrick Mahomes in round 4, even your Josh Allen, sliding into round 3, I don't think those are egregious picks because the safety, the consistency of the position has been there. We've been better than ever at selecting these guys. These guys have been better than ever at scoring points, and their price isn't egregious. So, hey, don't hate the player, hate the ADP. If all of a sudden Jalen Hurts is going, pick 15 next year, I'm probably going to be waiting because when quarterbacks are going early, that's going to be pushing other positions down the board. But my biggest takeaway from this is probably ignoring that middle class of QBs because, again, I think their price is being inflated because of how good the top tier QBs are, but I don't think we're necessarily seeing that same sort of consistency and same sort of ability to predict who the good, not great QBs are going to be. And we saw that resoundingly last season. And hey, maybe it was just a 1-year blip on the radar once again. But man, guys, QB7 through QB12 last year, we had Kyler Murray, who, okay, he was drafted as the QB5. Daniel Jones drafted as the QB28. Geno Smith, QB35. Tua, QB16. Trevor Lawrence, QB18. And Kirk Cousins, QB15. Don't forget Justin Fields slid into the top 6 tier before that. So really, top tier guys, I think we do a good job of recognizing them. But after that, don't overestimate our ability to really discern the total, point by point difference, a massive difference, I should say, between guys that have less just out of this world physical traits and just these fantasy roles that can't be really matched by quarterbacks that don't run to the same extent. Final question now, guys. Is there still hope for finding an upside fantasy quarterback in the later rounds? Because again, if we want to fade that middle tier of quarterbacks, but we don't manage to get the, upper top 6 guys, what are we supposed to do to get a quarterback in fantasy? And there still has been a decent track record of finding high-end quarterbacks in later rounds. Specifically, we've had exactly 10 quarterbacks over the past 10 years have an ADP outside of the first 10 rounds, pick 120 to be specific. So these guys finished as top 6 signal callers in fantasy points per game. So not even top 12 here. We're looking at top 6 true upside players. They were 2013 Nick Foles, 2014 Ben Roethlisberger, 2015 Ty God Taylor, 2015 Blake Bortles, what a time to be alive, 2016 Matt Ryan doing king shit, 2017 Carson Wentz also surprisingly doing king shit, 2017 Alex Smith getting the most out of Tyreek Hill, CC Tua, 2019 Dak Prescott, hell of a year, 2019 Matt Stafford was doing awesome before he got injured in that year, and Kenny Galladay led the NFL in receiving touchdowns that season. What a wild time. And most recently 2022 Justin Fields. So again, that was outside of the first 10 rounds, pick 120. We did have 2 guys that barely missed that you're going to know these seasons. 2018 Patrick Mahomes and 2019 Lamar Jackson had triple digit ADPs, just not fully outside the 120 qualifiers. So look, this history is telling us in terms of 1 through 6, the super high upside guys, you can't really expect more than 1, maybe 2 of those quarterbacks to be there in the late rounds, but they have been there in the top 12. Again, you look at the average ADP of these top 12 quarterbacks, and for the past season, for it to be 148, before that, it was 88, 94, 145 in 2019. Again, we just haven't been good at picking the low end QB1. So my big takeaway with this, guys, don't overestimate our ability to tier out these quarterbacks beyond the aliens, because that's the discrepancy we're seeing. We're seeing people have the same level of confidence splitting up our Jalen Hurts and Josh Allens of the world with everyone else, Dax and Russell Wilsons and all that. And I think we're doing a good job with that. Again, everything shows that we do a good job of predicting who the top 6 quarterbacks are going to be. Our ability to decipher who's going to be between, QB7 and QB18, that's the part that I think everyone is being far too confident about at the moment. And that's why, just throwing some darts at those later round quarterbacks like Daniel Jones, Justin Fields, Geno Smith, when we find out he wins the job, shit like that, or just playing the waiver wire if you're in, a shallower league and your league mates aren't going to be loading up at the position. I think that makes way more sense than spending top 100 picks on pocket passers that we just can't have the same level of confidence in drafting, because look what's happened the last 5 years. These guys have not been as consistently high scoring as the top 6 quarterbacks. We haven't been able to predict them as well, and they've just been readily more available late than any other position. The average ADP of a top 12 quarterback this past year was, again, 110.5. The average ADP of a top 24 running back was pick 40. Top 24 wide receiver, pick 45. Top 12 tight end was 80.6. Fields, Daniel Jones, Geno Smith, Tua, and Trevor Lawrence were all available outside the top 10 rounds last season. Meanwhile, we had 1 running back, Jamal Williams, finished as a top 24 RB, 0 top 24 wide receivers, and 2 top 12 tight ends in Evan Ingram and David Njoku. So if you want to spend high on one of those top 6 quarterbacks, I do think that's reasonable. The data tells us that we've done a good job identifying them. They've been scoring more points than ever, and their ADP is still at an affordable enough cost, most likely going to 2023, that we're not even have to worry about going back 10 years ago. But guess what? Even if it does start to sink down to what the ADP was 10 years ago, they're scoring more points than they were then. So we can feel a little bit better about it. It's, again, that middle class of QBs that I do think we need to make a much bigger habit of considering to fade if that discrepancy continues to be so wide between them and the guys late. So not saying this is going to completely play out this way in 2023. The public is smart sometimes, and they're going to, get around to this. Maybe we do see those, QBs 13 through 20, maybe your Daniel Joneses of the world, and, Trevor Lawrence. I know those players specifically are going to be drafted higher this year, but those guys holding that ADP ranking, I mean, if they're all of a sudden climbing up and being neck and neck with that low end QB1 group, we're not seeing that same sort of advantage. So maybe you should go ahead and shoot your shot on the low end QB1 that you like. But if that stays different, guys, and it makes sense why the difference is as big as it is, because, most sharper players, I think, are only drafting one quarterback more times than not, as long as you're not in a super flex league or anything like that. So, once teams kind of get there, all 12 owners pick their quarterback, like, you're not going to see anyone taking a second quarterback for a long time. That's why those ADPs get driven so further down. So I'm pretty confident that there's always going to be that rather unwarranted gulf between the QB7, the QB12, and then into that next tier of guys. And I think that's where we can really take advantage of it in 2023 and beyond. So 2 main takeaways from this edition of the PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. Top tier signal callers are scoring better and more consistently than ever, and they're doing it at an affordable price that we have been fantastic at identifying. And point number 2, the late round crop of signal callers has demonstrated the ability to consistently infiltrate the low end QB1 conversation. We have been far less good at identifying who those low end QB1s are going to be before the season. So ban the middle class of, quarterbacks in fantasy, I guess. Trying to think what's the, political agenda that we could call this. I don't know. It's like we're really hyping up the rich and the poor, but we're saying screw the middle class. So if you're smarter than me and you got this, completely figured out, you're screaming the word, let me know on Twitter at iHeartitz. Always appreciate feedback, especially when I can't remember a freaking political term that I'm sure I learned 10 freaking times at my freaking liberal arts school. So whatever, that all aside, everyone, before we get out of here, I want to give a couple shout outs to our lovely sponsors who help bring you this lovely edition of the PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. First up, our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. I want to tell you about the easiest and most fun way to spice up the playoff football season. It's Underdog Fantasy and their pick'em game. Just look for your favorite or least favorite player stats. Pick whether you think they'll end up with a higher or lower total than that number in this week's game, and you can win up to 20 times your money in a single night. Underdog keeps it super simple with their easy-to-use website and mobile apps. Pick between 2 and 5 players for your pick'em entry. Get all your picks right, and you'll take home some cold, hard cash. It's simple to get started. Just head on over to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the app. Sign up for promo code PFF, and Underdog will double your first deposit up to $100. That's Underdog Fantasy, promo code PFF. Get in on the action today. Also got to shout out our friends over at Viore. As always, I'm repping their hat. Fits my big ass head. As someone that's struggled my entire life to find good fitting hats, I've had to rock them backwards, and then people are seeing me on the podcast. Some of our European faithful are saying, why do Americans always wear their hats like jackasses? And yeah, I get it, guys, but some hats, man, I put it on front, and I'm not saying I'm, the best looking guy in the world, but I feel good with this hat on. So isn't that 9/10 of the battle anyway? Because even if I do look terrible with it, I think I look okay. And I would assume that most people out there aren't going to come to my face and tell me how bad it looks. So if I feel good about it, I think that's pretty reasonable that you could feel good about it. How's that for a freaking ad, Vittori? Viore. Oh, Marvin Vittori. Have my UFC name in there. Marvin Vittori is a good, well-dressed man, pause and everything. But Marvin Vittori, I'm sure, is also a fan of Viore. So Viore is an investment in your happiness. I could not have said that better myself. For our listeners, they are offering 20% off your first purchase. Get yourself some of the most comfortable and versatile clothing on the planet at viore.com/PFF pod. And that's spelled VUORI.com/PFF pod. Not only will you receive 20% off your first purchase, but enjoy free shipping on any U.S. orders over $75 and free returns. Go to Viore, VUORI.com/PFF pod and discover the versatility of Viore clothing today. Going to wrap up this edition of the PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. Appreciate you guys tuning in with me throughout this long off season. Going to be back next week with running back and wide receiver breakdowns. Hopefully coming away with some similar longer term but actionable trends for the future with those positions as well next week. And before we know it, guys, going to be Super Bowl season, free agency, and all of a sudden best ball will be upon us once again. Obviously, Dynasty, you freaking sickos are grinding us, like all hell right now. And I'm doing that with my 2 or 3 teams too. Make sure to get some guests on sooner rather than later to help break down some of that goodness. So appreciate you guys tuning in. As always, I'm Ian Hartitz. Until next time, take care, everybody.